Alright, so what I wanted to do is just give you a little update on what I've been doing with this initiative called Prosocial, or Prosocial.world is kind of the name of this entity that we're creating together. Right. Okay, so Prosocial is four things. It's an idea, a sort of frame, a lens for viewing the world. It's a process, a specific process that we use to work with groups to help them collaborate more effectively. It's a community of practice, so we've got about 100 facilitators that are using the process now around the world, and they're using it in all sorts of sectors, from schools to corporations to government departments to community groups and so forth. And it's also a research agenda, and I'm just going to briefly touch on each of those four things during this talk. So as an idea, I took some photos on my way into work this morning. When I come up here from Canberra, I live over in, well, I stay over in Kirribilli in a little unit over there, and my walk to work is around the harbour in the morning. It's kind of like enough to make anybody feel happy. But I was thinking about, as I often do, wandering along, thinking about the constant interplay in our lives of cooperation with others. You know, what does it take to actually get these ferries actually working? You know, the timetabling, the planning, the paying of salaries, somebody, you know, thinking really carefully about safety on the ship and how we can look after other people and so forth. And, you know, humans do this naturally. It's part of our everyday lives. But animals, of course, just don't do it. You know, like, can you imagine if this was monkeys crossing the road or something? You know, if it was a monkey sitting in the bus there, it might just run over all the other monkeys, you know, or something like that. But we have rules and laws and agreements and everything. We've got this really dense network of social interactions that allows us to get to work together effectively in massive, now global networks, which we've never really evolved to do. All of this has just happened in our brains. We've just evolved these social fictions to help us work together. And then, of course, you get the other end of the spectrum in terms of this. You probably won't be able to read it, but it says, Australia, love it or fuck off back to where you came from. That was another thing, you know, just walking along the street and you see that. So self-interest, collective interest. This is walking around another part of Kirribilli here. Behind me there's a whole set of rather wealthy looking houses, and I guess one of them must have decided they'd rather have a view and they chopped the trees down, and that's the result. So I often find myself thinking about this tension between what's in our own interest, what's self-interest, and what's in collective interest. So just stop for a moment and think about what brings you here today, what matters to you about being part of this group. And if you think about it, there'll probably be things like wanting to learn something, or wanting to enjoy it, or be entertained, or something like that. So there'll be a whole set of self-interest, but there'll also be some collective interests, wanting to be part of a community, wanting to belong and support people, wanting me to do well, hopefully, etc., etc. So there'll be a whole lot of collective stuff going on as well. And we're constantly in that interplay. Joseph and I were talking this morning about sociopaths as being sort of extreme down the end of sort of self-interest all the time. But you can just start to see almost every moment through this lens of individual interest versus collective interest. You know, should I shut up and let you talk would be, you know, in your interest as opposed to mine, or something like that. So the idea that is behind Prosocial, and it's taken me a long time to get this, but I'm working with David Sloan-Wilson, who's a pretty famous evolutionary biologist, and we're basically thinking about evolution and talking about evolution all the time. The core idea is this notion of variation, selection and retention, which is the basic process of change within evolution. But in multiple streams and at multiple levels. So we know, for example, you know, most people when they think about evolution, they think about genetic evolution over time, over long time frames. It's now increasingly understood that a major determinant of phylogeny, the behaviour that we display, is epigenetic. So it's genes being switched on and off through experience, and that can be inherited from parents and so forth. So there's a whole genetic stream of evolution going on, variation, selection, retention. Then there's an epigenetic stream going on. But there's also in our major determinant of our experience is behavioural evolution. Right? If I go to this door as it were, and it doesn't close properly, I'll try something else, and I'll just try variation, different things, and eventually I'll manage to close the door. And next time I'll remember that, and I'll do it more quickly and more effectively. Variation, selection according to whether I've been able to actually do something useful, and retention through memory. So there's evolution going on in the behavioural stream. What's really interesting to me is that as humans, unlike animals, we have this symbolic, verbal overlay, which animals presumably don't have, where we're basically constructing fictions. We're constructing, a shared idea of IPPE as a particular thing. If we were all killed by a or something like that, IPPE would not exist. It only exists in our heads, and it's a sort of shared construction, if you like. And of course, all of that has multiple levels as well, and this is the bit that David Sloan Wilson is particularly big on. He's quite famous for saying that selfishness beats altruism in individuals, altruistic groups beat selfish groups. So he's interested in how evolution, variation and selection occurs between levels. So I'll give you a very concrete example of that. Cancer is basically cells acting selfishly, all right? So it's a single, normally we have cells in our body that are so deeply coordinated and integrated that they form organs which form a fully functioning human being. But if one cell decides that it kind of likes itself and it's going to replicate out of control, then that's what we call cancer. So that's an example of selfishness interfering with the smooth operation of the collective as a single organism. The same thing is obviously happening in terms of behaviour. One of the ideas that I found really interesting in Prosocial is to sort of think about mindfulness from the point of view of I am a group. I'm a group of competing sort of psychological urges, if you like. I am the urge to promote and present and to teach and so forth, but I'm also the urge to protect myself and to hide away. And you can really understand psychopathology in terms of this sort of the idea that we are a collective of competing urges, generally speaking, reaching out and opening and closing in and protecting. So smooth functioning of ourselves as a whole individual is to be able to allow ourselves to have all of those parts of ourselves, to give them space and to honour them and to acknowledge them without letting any one of them, like say for example our anxiety, come to dominate the entire organism as a cancer. So this is a sort of way of thinking that I'm trying to introduce, which is really about groups all the way up and down. Everything is a group, everything is groupy, and it's always the possibility that the lower level the lower level of organisation can interfere and dominate the higher level of organisation, or vice versa, that the higher level of organisation, the IPPE identity can squeeze out your individuality. This constant tension between individual and collective interests. So, what we're thinking about is what does it take to transition a group from a collection of individuals to acting more like a single organism, what David calls a major evolutionary transition, going from a single termite to a whole termite now that's acting as a group. But what does it look like when you get a really high-performing team that's acting almost like a single organism? What does it take to do that? And for humans, it takes integration of what matters to me and you individually with what matters to us. So the general framework for what Prosocial is trying to do is to move a group from being a collection of individuals to being a genuinely us-regarding organism, if you like, that's functioning well together. And that takes two things. It takes some psychology, but it also takes a set of cultural practices or social agreements. And so Prosocial is targeting both of those in its process. I'm just going to briefly describe that. So as a process, Prosocial is some combination in any order of the following things. And I'll illustrate what each of them are. the individual ACT matrix, acceptance and commitment training matrix, the group matrix, the 8 core design principles from Lynn Ostrom's Nobel Prize winning work, short to medium term goal setting, and then it's a research program, evaluation of changes around that. So the ACT matrix, what's that? I thought I'd illustrate that with one little story of, it's actually not a picture of the pharmacy that I worked with, but I worked with a pharmacy in Canberra, and I was called in there was a conflict between Janine, the boss, Lynn, who was a 50-something-year-old Chinese lady who was a very accomplished pharmacist but had to completely retrain when she came to Australia, and was sort of senior pharmacist in the group, but back in China she'd been in charge of her own pharmacy. And then there was a young woman, Kai, I got the names around the wrong way, I made these names up, so anyway, young woman who was sort of up and coming. She was really interested in leadership and management, and she was sort of throwing her weight around, and Janine, the boss, was seeing her as her successor. Janine's biggest wish in life was to basically stop working in the pharmacy and just rake in the money. And so she was trying to set up her successors, if you like. Anyway, I was called in by a workers' compensation company because the older Chinese lady was off work, sick indefinitely, on stress leave, and they wanted me to help her get back to work. And so what I did with her, did with all of them actually, was a process of, first of all, the individual ACT matrix, which I'll just illustrate in a moment, and then the group matrix to try to bring together some shared, what are we trying to accomplish here, to try to integrate individual and collective interests. So, how many of you know the ACT matrix already? Some way, have you seen this before? Not many? Okay. Joseph sort of puts his hand up. Joseph hates the ACT matrix. It's okay, he's got his own model, he can talk another day. So it's basically these two main dimensions. Moving towards reinforcement or away from punishment, for want of a better term, away from aversive experience. So that's what you might call positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, essentially. And then it also tracks what's going on internally in what from a relational frame theory point of view we think of as the verbal stream, the symbolic stream, and what's going on in the behavioural stream. What's actually, and then the other, the top part is what's actually happening in the world. What am I sensing? And what am I doing with my arms and legs? And so for whatever her name is, Kai or Lin or whatever, the elderly Chinese lady, what mattered to her was respectful relationships, freedom to choose how I work, health, harmony, growing my skills and capabilities. It took a little while for her to trust me enough to start talking about these things, right? It was quite a conversation. And I'm just noting down stuff as we're talking about times when she's felt most alive at work and so forth. And I'm just filling this in. I'm not sort of forcing her through it. But I'm also noticing things like fear of being overlooked, anger at disrespect. If I hadn't left China, I would have had my own pharmacy by now. Who does she think she is? Worry that my back, maybe it was a back pain, but it was really a stress pain. I'm not assertive enough. I can't bear being at work. So these are sort of internal experiences that hook people and the aversives that they want to move away from, if you like. And then what she was doing was she wasn't going to work, she was making a compensation claim, she'd stopped talking entirely in the group, etc. Here are some things she could do. I mean, this takes a long time to get to this point, right? Because people are really stuck in all of this stuff. Lynn's a bitch, I hate her. They're really stuck in that space on the left-hand side. And for her to start saying, oh, maybe I could take part in the discussion that we're going to have as a collective, or maybe I can raise my concerns, took quite a long time. But you're doing sort of psychological flexibility work with them. What would it take for you just to notice these thoughts and feelings and maybe still move in the direction of these things that matter to you, even in the presence of all this crap, in the presence of all this yuckiness. So that's what we're doing with the ACT matrix, and it's pretty simple, incredibly simple tool, but really, really powerful, because a lot of goal-setting tools are just about the positive reinforcers. They're not about what the negative reinforcers are, what's the aversives that show up whenever you really care about something. So it's really important to be able to map that. And then, of course, you know, the whole ACT stance is about, mindfulness stance, if you like, is about, you know, like I said, what would it take for you to be able to move in the direction of these things? Well, maybe one strategy is being able to notice them without reactivity, being able to just make space for these thoughts and feelings without being dictated to by them, without them acting selfishly, without them dominating your space. I'm sure there's a whole new therapy brand I can come up with, you know, intrapersonal social therapy or something. Anyway, so once you've done, we might then do a group ACT matrix where we just do the same sort of thing, but instead of asking what matters to you, we're asking what matters to us. And this is in the context of a group, and we're starting to have a conversation about what, you know, what gets in the way of us moving towards what we care about. What could we be doing differently? So you can start to have the multi-level conversation, and then you can start to integrate self and collective interest. But that conversation on its own only goes as far as why do we exist. It doesn't actually get to the other key piece of what you need for social cooperation, which is all those social agreements. You know, that people actually stop when there's a red traffic light, for example, or all the stuff that we need to have in place, the rules, the institutions, the norms, the social practices. The core design principles came from Lynn Ostrom's work on how people manage or don't manage common pool resources like fisheries and water all around the world. Did a massive international study for which he eventually won the Nobel Prize, essentially showing that the tragedy of the commons that you may have heard of, that people essentially are self-interested utility maximisers, and that they'll basically take as much as they can out of self-interest. She essentially showed that that's not the case, that, you know, we can, if you actually look at groups that are more or less successful, the ones that are more successful have in place these 8 sort of core ideas that help groups to act in the interests of the collective, or these core agreements. So this is some data from IPPE that you've seen before, probably, most of you. We did a little exercise on this. Some of you might remember answering these questions. This group has a shared sense of identity and purpose. The demands and benefits of participating in this group are distributed equitably between its members. The core design principles, well, this is sort of our phrasing of the core design principles. It's not exactly the way Ostrom put them, because we had to generalise them to all groups. One of the key changes that we made, and I'm proud to say this was a change that I introduced, was that Ostrom was very much focused on sanctions for transgressions, because she was in groups where people didn't need any motivation to, you know, like if you're reliant upon a fishery to survive, you don't really need a motivation to fish or to cooperate. What you need is sanctions for transgressions from your shared agreements. But when you generalise it to other groups, obviously like in a workplace, a really key part of getting cooperative behaviour is actually encouraging helpful behaviours. So we had to broaden out the 5th principle from just this one. If someone behaves in a way that's unhelpful or disruptive, people respond appropriately to discourage that, sanctions, to also include the opposite, like that people give positive reinforcement as well. And so these principles basically incorporate these 3 ideas. How do we motivate more collective thinking? How do we suppress more selfish thinking? And how do we translate that into multiple levels? So how do we not just get individuals working in groups, but how do we get groups working with each other to form groups of groups, which allows for large collectives? And when you've got those 3 things in place, encouraging coordination, cooperation, discouraging selfishness, and at the capacity to scale that up into higher levels, you've got a very powerful set of principles, or sort of ways of directing people's attention. And you can see in our own institution we've got some pretty substantial variability between positive psych and motivational behaviour and so forth, which we could discuss.
So previously positive psych is the best and clearly better than the other group?
I'm not going to buy into that conversation. This is not a very...
Positive psych,
This is not a very...
We don't care about the other groups.
So this is just a little piece of work that Herb and I guess, are starting to do, and I'm sorry, Herb, I apologise, I'm dragging my heels on, I'm just not getting to it, but we'll get there eventually. Developing this scale, which basically is a set of items that I've come up with that are meant to reflect the different principles. But this is just some early data where I've, in a cross-sectional sample, so there's all sorts of problems with this design, but in a cross-sectional sample we've just correlated these design principles with group commitment, group satisfaction and overall trust. And what these numbers are across the top is just bivariate correlation coefficients, so just the R. Essentially what that's saying is you're getting correlations around 0.5% of the variance. And there's some interesting variability. You know, some of the principles seem to be more predictable than others. Interestingly, this one that we added in seems to be, although I haven't some of these differences are significant, but I haven't tested them recently. But you know, that one does seem to be robustly predicted. So, second example to illustrate the use of the principles. This was a group I worked with. It's actually the 100 best ACT trainers in the world, the peer-reviewed ACT trainers. These guys are supposed to be, and girls, guys, generically, are meant to be, you know, the best in the world. And unfortunately, they're all arguing with each other and actually functioning really poorly as a group. It's really taught me quite a lot about how an individualistic therapy is completely useless for getting people to actually get along with one another, because the whole focus on just values and what do I care about doesn't ask the question what do we care about, and it doesn't ask the question how are we going to work together, how are we actually going to meet multiple values. If everybody's just, Joseph and I again, we were talking about this morning, if everyone's just insisting on their values, it actually leads to self-righteousness, which is exactly what we're seeing in this group. So this group is just an online forum of people supposedly loving and cooperating with one another, but actually sniping and backstabbing and you know, having all sorts of difficulties. And so I was asked, along with a colleague of mine, Beata Ribet from Germany, to do the prosocial process with this international group online. And we started by doing individual matrices, seeing why people cared about the group. And we did a group matrix, what do we care about as a collective, what's our purpose? And then we started talking about the individual principles and where we had strengths and where we had weaknesses. What became really, really clear was that there were three main problems. We didn't actually know why the group existed, which is incredibly common in my experience. It's extraordinary how often you go into a group and say, why do you exist? You know, like they just don't know. Why do you exist? Why do we exist? To publish papers, to get an RCI? Is that why we exist? I think so. Anyway, you know, it's a good conversation to have. The other thing that we didn't have as a group was any way of making decisions collectively together. We had no processes in place, so no way of making decisions. And we had obviously problems with conflict resolution because there were people fighting each other on about things like, you know, he's teaching in my patch and Russ Harris has put up an online course that's taking away the market from the rest of the world and da-da-da-da-da. So those sorts of things. And we needed a way of sorting through it. I'll cut to the chase. We formed two committees. One of the things I've learned in this process is the importance of forming coalitions of power, because they were never going to listen to me on my own, but I got, you know, Robin Walser on one committee and other high-powered figures into one committee for developing a conflict resolution process and one committee for developing a decision-making process. We ended up coming up with this really cool consent-based decision-making process where anybody can see an issue in the group and they can generate a proposal, and then people can vote on the proposal and they can say, you know, yeah, it's okay, or no, I don't like it, or whatever. And it's got, I won't go into the details, but it's not inefficient. It's actually got reasonable efficiency built into it, so it's not just a good talk fest. And that's really generated my interest in how can we make organisations much flatter and less hierarchical and rely less upon, you know, being told what to do and having processes and procedures. What if all of us could sort of see something that we want improved around IPVs, and we could generate a proposal that there was a clear line of actioning where people could talk about it and so forth. I think it would, generate a lot of interest and perhaps cut through some of the issues we face. Getting all this on video, I don't know. And also a conflict resolution escalation procedure, which I'm still learning about, and turns out it's really good, like we get people talking to one another, etc., etc. But I had a very much an internal focus, and what I have realised since is that some of the conflicts are so serious that they actually need to have a vehicle to go outside to a more legal area. Another way that we've used the principles is more as a lens for measurement. So this is a project that Rhonda particularly is spearheading, but we're all developing together, the Positive Policing Project. And we've come up with a design to have 10 Indigenous youth and 5, high-performing police officers, 5 police officers that actually get the idea of relations with Indigenous youth and are doing a good job with it. And to get them into a room for 4 or 5 days, what we want to do is, first of all, get them running through the matrix process to sort of find out what they care about and what gets in the way of positive relations, to maybe start to explore a group matrix, what would it look like if we were actually cooperating, and then to teach them how to do interviews, teach them how to listen, teach them how to ask questions, teach them how to use a voice recorder. And then on the 3rd day, we're going to have people that they've invited come in, and they're going to interview them in a sort of coached environment. And we'll get the transcripts done really quickly, and then we'll start doing thematic analysis. But instead of just kind of getting them to do the analysis, which is sort of hard to do, I've set up a set of 8 questions around the principles. What's the purpose here? What does equity look like? Those are not the exact questions, they're more concrete than that. But, the principles are sort of pointing them in the direction of particular things they can look for in each of the interviews. Any questions at this point? We're whizzing through a whole lot of different things. So I've already mentioned the group matrix is, what's important to us about the group, or what's important to us. I put this slide in here because one of the methods that I've started to use a lot with groups is we do the individual matrix work first of all, and we end up with a sort of shared map of what we each individually care about. And then instead of going into the group matrix directly, more and more I'm starting to talk about the principles, and then using the group matrix as a way of embedding the principles. So what matters to us about, say for example, fair and inclusive decision making? Why would it matter that we were involved in decision making together? Maybe it matters because I'll be more engaged, or maybe it matters because we need more minds on more inputs to good decisions or something like that. So you can actually get people and to contextualise the principles using the group matrix. We've done one intervention where I divided them all up into 8 different groups, and they each worked on a different principle. How can we embed this? What shows up for us and gets in the way of using this principle? So for fair and inclusive decision making, for example, a really common one is the manager says, I'm going to lose control if it's inclusive decision making, or it'll be incredibly inefficient. Everybody will be, we won't have a way of coming to agreement. So this is a really helpful way to kind of embed and contextualise that. All right. So by way of an update, we've recently been awarded, I think it's about $273,000 US. When I say we, David Sloan Wilson went for the grant. I wasn't actually named on the grant, but I've been appointed as project coordinator for this. David's a really good, big picture, visionary kind of guy, but he's fairly chaotic, and I'm a pretty good organiser. So he wants me to pick up a day and a bit a week to do a 4-day-a-week job. So that's basically allowing us. Well, let me tell you a little bit about this grant. It's quite interesting what he's done. So the grant title was called the the Diverse Intelligences Initiative, Morality in the Machine Age. And I thought, how can you make a connection between that and prosocial? But this is how David framed it, and it's very clever. He basically defined intelligence as any system that receives information as input and results in meaningful action as output. And when you define intelligence that way, you can have an intelligence group. You can have a group that receives information and acts collectively in a meaningful way. And what is it that allows a group to be intelligent in that way? It's the social agreements, the culture, the practices, the norms that you create that allow the group to function. So, and there, as we've already argued, surprise, surprise, oh look, we've got 8 of them here that we can use that function collectively to suppress selfish action and facilitate collective action at multiple scales. So our grant is all about building a website which allows for discussion groups, community engagement, online training in the method, measurement processes, measurement services. We're also engaging with partners, and this is part of my purpose in giving this talk, was to, in the hope that maybe some piece of your work might touch on prosocial and you might wish to partner with us, where we're just basically training people up and giving them the opportunity to use our measures in context, and hopefully we'll end up with like 100 case studies / environments in which prosocial is being used. And so just to give you a sense of what that might look like, and then I'll wrap up and throw it over to questions. This is my PhD student, Robert Stiles, and friend. Now, Dr. Robert Stiles. He has done 2 really amazing pieces of work with the Australian Public Service. He was in Canberra with me. One with the Museum of Australian Democracy and one with the Department of Finance. Essentially, he ran through the process as I was describing it. There were lots of wrinkles and particularities to the process, but I thought I'd just focus on the outcomes. I've shown you these data before on a previous prosocial talk, but just as a reminder. One of the things he was able to do, is just really, really lucky, the Australian Public Service every year has a survey of the entire public service. And so we got data on not just the museum, but also the rest of the public service during the same period, between 2014 and 2015, when he was doing this work. And if you just take that one item at the end there, managers in my agency value employees, the MOAD went up by 25% across the year, while the public service under Mr. Abbott went down by 18%. What a lovely man. Look at the last few days in terms of self-interest and collective interest. Anyway, so that was pretty spectacular. And then these are data from the Department of Finance. It's a terrible slide, but I'll just read to you. I would recommend my agency as a place to work. Between 2016 and 2017 went up by 24% in this particular group. So positive outcomes across the board. Unfortunately, I don't have the comparative data for what the rest of the APS was doing, but pretty good outcomes for finance as well. And then this is the last case study I'll tell you about. This is a guy called James Lemon, who works in the National Health Service in Scotland, in a place called Dumfries in Galloway, which is right down here in the bottom part of Scotland. And I've just over the last couple of days I've been interviewing him. He picked up one of our talks from 3 years ago and a bit of a training manual and just went off and started doing prosocial in the National Health Service. He's now got 14 teams doing prosocial, really with amazing outcomes. It's all anecdotal at this point, so I'd love to, we're just putting some measures in place to look at how it affects people. But the context is really interesting. He works in he's a psychologist, a resident psychologist in a team of medical professionals working with children with chronic illnesses, in particular cystic fibrosis, rheumatism, and there's other groups that are working on diabetes and so forth. And they generally speaking have a paediatrician, a nurse, physiotherapist, sometimes a psychologist if they're rich. And what he started to do was, first of all, he noticed that a lot of the problems that were arising came out of the family dynamics. So the kid was terrified of dying, basically, and one of their responses was they'd stop taking medications, and then there'd be fighting going on between the parents and the child, and then there'd be the medical professionals who'd be blaming the parents, you know, and there was just all this interpersonal stuff going on in the care of young children with chronic illnesses. So what he did was he started using the matrix, and he started using the principles to start building more effective relations in the context of these teams. I think I've actually spoken to much of this. Coordination difficulties within medical teams and so forth. And so he's just been working over quite a long period now, and prosocial has become sort of part of the furniture, part of the shared language. So they'll have away days where the group will get together and talk about, you know, the matrix, how's it looking now? Has anything changed? You know, he's finding things like the stuff that's was over on the left-hand side, the undiscussables and so forth. It's now sometimes hard to populate that left-hand side because they've actually talked about all of these things that were previously getting in the way of them moving towards what they cared about. They've done very practical things like changing the workflow and sharing, becoming much more transparent in sharing emails and so forth. And the teams themselves are starting to use the principles in their intergroup conversations, and so it's sort of spreading out organically. Jim described it as like a virus, which they like that metaphor in the medical context. A virus of prosocial, you know, people seeing that prosocial is working and then other groups picking it up. So that was all I wanted to do. I just wanted to show you sort of some of the breadth of what we're doing with it. Like I said, it's being used in schools, it's being used in corporations. One of the things we're sort of grappling with is how do we keep people engaged in the corporate setting without them just sort of spinning off and taking the ideas and flogging it for high prices in consultancy, which we don't actually care if they do that because we're just about dissemination. But what we're trying to do is try and create a community where people are actually contributing to the research as well. So that's challenging. I suppose my last reflection is just, I think asking this question of, you know, like in each moment, what's the piece that's, you know, my authentic self-expression, self-interest, and what's the collective interest? That asking that question, living in that frame, over the course of the last 3 or 4 years has caused a pretty profound shift in my own way of thinking. I think it's a very, you know, can you imagine if Donald Trump asked that question, or Tony Abbott, or, you know, some of the people who are public figures in our lives were asking that question. What matters to me, what matters to us, and how can I bring those together? Not the kind of dumb question of, you know, like there's this social pressure on us to just be good for the collective and everything, but we have to bring our whole selves to things. You know, we have to be asking what matters to me and integrating it with the collective. So I think I'll just end on that point and see if there's some interest in a conversation. Questions, or anyone like to know anything about what I'm doing, or anything I wasn't clear about? Or
When's your book out?
Oh, I love that question. Just like, when's my thesis done, right? I've been writing a book with Steve Hayes and David Flame Wilson for 3.5 years, is it, I think, now? We've missed 3 deadlines to the publisher, and we're not going to miss the next one, which the manuscript is due on November the 1st. It's been really hard. I've been going round and round trying to develop the ideas, as well as, you know, simultaneously developing the ideas, as well as them, you know, publishing. They've each published a book of their own in the meantime. So trying to get really, really popular, high-performing people to cooperate has been challenging. But we'll get there. November the 1st is when the manuscript is due. You want to be a draft reader? Sure. I need people. Actually, I need non-academics. I need people that are normal. To be
Can't find anybody like that in this.
Yeah. Anything else? Unless you're dumbfounded. Yes, Kira.
So, mostly your case studies were done in what perceived to be Western nations, and do you look at the Western versus Eastern?
Yeah, that's a great question. I like that. So, Yes, everything we've done is in the West at this point. I have some interest from Asia in this, like at the last conference where I presented this, I had a Chinese woman come up to me and say she wanted to use it in schools, and I also had a guy from Qatar who runs a whole school network that wants to use it. So that's the Middle East. So we're sort of spreading out. But you're thinking about like the collectivist.
So the collective versus individualistic societies that we tend to.
Yeah, look, it's really not something we've explored in much depth yet. I will say that I don't believe Ostrom's, I'm just trying to think whether Ostrom's work had Asian examples in it. It certainly had Indian examples in it. I can't recall if it had sort of East Asian examples. And I suppose, is India a collectivist country? Not really, is it? Anyway, what's your hypothesis? Do you think some of these principles may not apply, or they'll apply differently?
I just pose questions. That's all
Sorry, I'm just punishing you for asking the questions.
And you could imagine a group. Could you imagine a group being too cooperative and nobody putting their self-interest enough forward?
Yes, easily I can imagine that.
So basically, if you look at like organizations, like I'll just look at Korean, like Samsung, or organizations that my friends work in. Like they will say that their self-interest is to do what's good for the country or for the company, or for something other than why are they here? Well, they'll say because Samsung needs me, or my boss needs me, or something.
Yeah, and we know from self-determination theory and from a load of other research that kind of it's unlikely to lead to a high degree of intrinsic motivation over the very long term. I mean, I don't know, I guess you could...
Look, it's really tricky because there's collective notion versus cooperation, and then there's shared responsibility versus very hierarchical. And I'm assuming that I don't have a good understanding of it, but I'm assuming that we're talking about very hierarchical oriented companies in many cases.
Yeah, but if you do it in a company versus even a family, it would be a very different dynamic, I think, of how they would respond to perhaps the notions.
I don't know. What I understood was the two Koreans that the father is the king.
Well, yeah, but they'll. I don't know. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah.
There is a rating of every country in terms of hierarchicalness. I know South America is very high in that.
Yeah.
I don't know about...
They call it high power distance is I think the cultural term for it.
Radical collectivism.
Yeah, that's...
Right. Yeah, so not a very satisfactory answer, but it's a great question, and that's something I do want to explore some more. I haven't been turning my attention in that direction yet.
But
Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, was just the partners, though, if we looked at where the partners came from, if it's a world charity, what the difference would be.
Actually, that's interesting. Okay, so one of our projects that's going off, there's a thing called World Happiness Day on the 19th of March, day after my birthday. And there's a guy that I met when I was at this event in St. Louis who's got this World Happiness Agora where he's basically trying to pull together groups from all around the world to celebrate World Happiness Day by having a week-long online seminar about how can I promote happiness in my community. And one of the groups has like 1,000 people in it from Jakarta, so that's an Indonesian group. And there's I think there's some other Asian groups there as well, so that might be an opportunity for us to actually test. Well, anyway, cut a long story short, he's very keen for Prosocial to sort of form the backbone of this collective thing that he's organising, and it does provide us with the opportunity to do a naturalistic experiment of Prosocial in groups in different cultures. Yes, Phil.
One of the things that I was thinking about this recently and looking around at people who are really pro-social oriented, you start with the individual and then you go to the group. What happens when the antisocial sort of stuff comes from people's blind sides?
Yeah.
So, if you're going from the individual, that requires a lot of internal insight that none of us can have.
Yeah. So one of the things is you're sort of building, my experience has been that you have to build trust in a group, and that takes time. Basically, working from basic behavioural principles, you have to create a context where people start to be just a little bit vulnerable, and I usually do that by modelling it or having people working in small groups before they work in large groups or whatever. And then you really richly reinforce being willing to share. And that over time, essentially if you think of trust as being willing to be vulnerable in the face of risk and expecting it to be positively reinforced, then that builds trust over time. That doesn't speak to your question about what you do with, I think your question basically comes out of the space of what do you do with people who are kind of deeply antisocial. Is that right?
Well, no, I think we're all like that. I mean, when I think around about, none of us thinks we're immoral, but when you ask other people, it's always because it's something that's, isn't within our kind of personality radar. If we're big picture people, it's people who are not little, what's the opposite of big picture? Small picture type people.
Yeah.
So we all have our blind sides, and that seems to me where the conflict lies is in the blind sides.
Absolutely. And so I just would say that the matrix is an extraordinarily powerful tool for helping people to reveal not just their opening out and reaching, but also their self-protection. So my experience is that 99.9% of the time, conflict is between two people who, when you step inside their perspective, it's perfectly reasonable. Okay, I want to leave open the possibility of sociopaths. I do think that there are some people, like for example, I once did a conflict resolution process in a renal unit in a hospital, and I did this whole dialogue process, and it was all going very well, and I was feeling wonderful about myself. I was teaching these surgeons to talk to one another and actively listen and all that. I found out later on one of them was collecting data for a court case he was bringing against all the rest of them. And he was basically just sitting there saying yes and writing it down and all this sort of stuff. Damn. And it kind of like just shook me to the core, like I'd been used to further this guy's legal claim. But even then, if I had have seen it, if I had have somehow had a way of surfacing that, it would have come out of a space of him feeling helpless and feeling that the legal challenge was the only way he could do it, etc., etc. I'm a pretty strong believer in. I don't know. There are some people who are probably irredeemably bad. I'm answering a different question, but it's one that's taxed me a lot. I basically came into this process thinking everybody is good unless they've been abused or whatever. And David Sloan Wilson says that's crap. If you look at a set of water striders in a pond, there'll always be a nasty water strider. That basically, like every group will have a really nasty individual in it. And you need that because you need, for whatever reason, the group dynamics relies upon having some capacity to protect itself against individualists. Otherwise, it could happily trot along and then eventually get completely decimated by one selfish person.
But there's also the notion that everybody's afraid of the nasty other person, and so even if you're willing to be open and all among yourself, there's somebody else in the group that you're going to assume is bad. And
sometimes, yeah. Although not every time.
Sometimes there's a conflict of purpose, though. Like when you have hierarchical organizations, sometimes the subculture has the purpose, say, of producing fantastic research and improving the human condition. Yeah. And then you have somebody in a different level of the hierarchy whose main purpose is a bonus or something like that. And so when you have so the first thing is collective purpose, but if you don't share the same purpose, and actually if the purposes are in conflict.
Yeah. But then you're better off having surfaced that and talked about it, if you can create the context where there's the trust. This is all on a continuum. It's not like...
This is hierarchy, and in fact, unlike the communal kind of thing that Ostrom got this from, they're quite... there was a tribal chief, but there was still a bit of a flat structure, and people could gang up and influence the tribal chief. It wasn't absolute dictator chief, was it? I don't know if they...
The Principle 7 and 8 came out of recognising vertical relations with, for example, regulatory bodies and so forth. So there was hierarchy built into the group work that she did. I think it's a tendency to sort of And I guess maybe I need to look at how I present this, but this is obviously not the answer to everything in an instant way, but it is a starting point that moves us down the continuum. It moves us down the track. We need this is like the central problem of human existence, I think. How do we cooperate? And so anything that can move us down the track is a plus.
But I guess, let me put it in social network terms, the premises that influence goes in all different directions, but sometimes in social networks, influence only comes one way, there's no influence another way. You see what I mean? So there's asymmetrical power, asymmetrical consequences for your behavior, those kinds of things, you know?
Yeah. There's always a dialectic though, isn't there? You know? Top-down power tries to coerce, bottom-up power collectively organises and strikes or reacts. There's always a dialectic in the long term.
In the long term. In the long term, we're dead.
Yeah, in the long term, we're dead.
Evolution takes hundreds of years.
It's also kind of interesting. I mean, one of the things that, one of the metaphors that Rich came up when we were talking about this issue is somehow or another we have to create an umbrella within our organization to create these principles that we want to espouse in an organization that doesn't necessarily reinforce those principles.
Yeah,
and that's a really hard one.
It is. You have this idea of a subculture kind of cooperating and existing in a larger group.
You think about that from an evolutionary point of view. Some of us are organisms that are operating in an environment that's not all that healthy and not all that conducive to life. You know, others are operating in a much more healthy environment. So there's one way in which we can just focus on surviving. There's another way in which we can focus on trying to change the environment to make it more conducive. And both are important. I mean, you can hide under an umbrella, but it's hard work. It takes a lot of work hiding under an umbrella and getting RCI thrown at you or whatever. You know, Jesus,
I guess the other thing I was thinking.
I think it's the second time I've used that example.
The other issue that I was thinking of when you were presenting is that almost all of your research is focused on case study. And I'm not saying that that isn't incredibly heuristic and valuable and so forth. And have you thought about how to develop a paradigmatic research design that it's really hard because you're working with a group and it's a collective group and you can't have, you can't have an easy control group. Within that, you can't use an easy weightless control.
Well, take the World Happiness Agora example. We've got a design for that. I mean, I think it has to be context specific. We've got a design where we were thinking of training up half the groups in prosocial and waitlisting the other half and seeing how well they do on the day. So measuring, how well they cooperate and so forth. But it's confounded with different locations around the world and so forth. So hopefully if we randomise the groups, that might help. We're just trying to do it on a situation by situation basis to see where we can develop some good out. Basically what we need is big organisations that have multiple groups, so we can create a randomised design with waitlisting. Another option that's coming up, and this is all sort of just optional, UNESCO has groups all around the world doing environment sustainability education. So that's another group that's sort of in lots of multinational contexts that has an interest in what we're doing.
I mean, even the multiple groups within an organization, it gets complicated because you have diffusion sorts of effects. I mean, if it's within an organization, everybody's going to know about it.
Not always. I mean, look at the National Health Service. They don't know what the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. I think we could do it. And multi-level modelling is going to be really important in what we do in terms of, and we haven't even really begun to. We've got a structure in place in our database for keeping track of groups within groups, but we haven't started to do the analysis.
I mean, we run into that same problem when we do educational research where we have school-based intervention. And the only way to evaluate that appropriately is to have an awful lot of schools, and it gets untractable. really quickly, although it sounds like you've got a reaching, arms that reach out worldwide so that you may be able to get all these multiple groups, which would be really exciting.
Yeah, well, people are coming along with sort of this free model of, I mean, it's all about networks, isn't it? It's just like make something that's kind of people seem to like, and then, just let them use it freely, and we're seeing massive dissemination because of that. So yeah, hopefully we will. I've just created, I was telling someone before, I'm sort of learning all these skills in marketing and using social media and having a CRM system, that's a customer relationship management system. And like the most exciting part of my life at the moment is having just developed a customer relationship management system that allows me to look at all the people that are using Prosocial, where they are and what sector they're working in. And it's really cool because now I've started hooking up all the schools people. You can have a little discussion group on Zoom here, and it's really starting to gel. And once that starts to happen, it's going to go gangbusters. All right. Thanks, everyone.